Hello everybody. So this is a little bit of a late night video. For all those who don't know, this is Phil Kruger of Phil's Bills. And I promised another video on Proposition 3. Anybody who doesn't know, this is California's Proposition 3. And so I wanted to get on that because I'm about 4 days overdue from it. Proposition 3 is the longest proposition in California's in this slate of propositions, and the reason it's so long is because it's essentially just a laundry list of mini spending bills, right? So Proposition 3, it's a spending bill on certain water needs. So for example, I think it's like 170 billion is spent for the Fresno Kern flood plans, right? So essentially what it does, it's $8.7 billion, right? But it disburses that $8.7 billion into a variety of laundry lists. And I spent the entire time, looking at this, right? And you can't read it, but it's a particularly long water list, right? For example, 750 million goes for grants for clean water. Just these are some of the highlights. 2.35 billion goes for watershed improvement restoration, right? 675 million goes for groundwater management. And this is probably the most controversial one, right? 200 million for the Central Valley Flood Protection Board. And also there's another one. Oh yes, 300 million for turf removal, right? Turf that's bad gets removed. And is more resistant to weather conditions. Essentially, so the bill does three big things, right? One, it allows for California to have cleaner water. Two, it protects the groundwater. It creates ways, or creates a financial pathway to have groundwater restoration. And three, it basically gives farmers a lot of money to modernize their farms. And that last one is the controversial perspective from the left, right? So the big objection that a lot of newspapers like the San Francisco Chronicle, like the Los Angeles Times have to it is, while it funds a lot of necessary water programs, it also gives a lot of money to a lot of wealthy farmers to do things that, in their papers' opinions, effectively change things, effectively are things that they can do on their own without government assistance, without taxpayer assistance. I find that argument kind of specious, right? I don't think that argument really goes anywhere with me, and here's why. So if you look at this $8.7 billion grant process, and I may have gotten that number wrong a little bit, but if you look at the $8 billion, the $8 billion is broken up into a series of grants, right? And when you break something up into a series of grants, what is a grant? Well, anybody who heard me talk about Proposition 1 already knows the answer, but since I often should repeat myself, I'll say it again. A grant is a gift of money from the government to essentially a nonprofit agency or a governing board to do with that money, fulfill certain purposes. So to do with that money, what they will do with that money is they will fulfill certain purposes that are outlined in the cause of the grant. So, for example, if you give the Central Valley Flood Protection Board $200 billion in grants, right, you have to have someone else apply for that grant. And when that person applies for that grant from the Central Valley Protection Board, they have to explain why they're improving the floodplain, right? So, really quickly, you're going to get from a government agency to a local development agency to a local developer or a local non-profit organization or some sort of local governance board that's going to do with that money as it sees fit, right? Here's the sum total of this is money's going to private entities anyway, right? Even under a grant process. That's the whole point of having a grant process. You have multiple public agencies and private agencies specifically employ grant writers to get this type of money, right? So all the state is doing with this is saying, look, we're going to let this money go out to these organizations, and people can do with as they wish, right? These organizations have to meet certain requirements. So, for example, of the grants, 50% has to be like any grant proposal has to have 50% funding from the organization and 50% funding from the grantor, right? So the step process is, again, federal government, local agency to grant applicant, right? All this does is open that first door. It doesn't open the second door, right? That's under the local agency control. So the reason why I think that kind of affects the argument as we've seen it from the anti-Prop 3 crowd is effectively the money that's going from the federal government, from the state government to local farmers essentially just goes beyond that first door process. It's just a more streamlined approach to something that would have to happen anyway. I think it's a recognition by the by the state government that, look, farms are rather important to the state economy. So I don't necessarily buy that argument because I think it masks the ultimate issue, and the ultimate issue here is that essentially the state of California doesn't have a solution to these problems. They're giving a bunch of money to a bunch of local organizations to figure out what to do with it. Anybody who saw my video on Prop 2, this is kind of the state's admission, right, that local agencies solve better than the state. Right, so Prop 2, I said probably don't vote on it. Vote yes on it because essentially it rests away from local control. Prop 3 is an admission that local control helps. Because of this entire bill, it just goes to specific local agencies. So, I, however, am not a fan of Prop 3. Why? Because while I think it does do all the needed financial allocations, at the same time, it's also a grant, or it's also a $8.7 billion gift from the general bond, and it's supposed to be paid off in 40 years as opposed to 30. Well, anybody who saw my video on Prop 1, I can tell you, look, the state has about $179 billion in debt, in bond debt, right, accumulated in the last 30 years, and that bond debt is accelerating, right? So imagine if we vote yes on Prop 1, which is probably going to happen, and you vote yes on Prop 3, which is also probably going to happen, right? You've now added more and more bonds to that debt, and I believe of the 8, I'd have to look to see how much of that's expended yearly. I'd have to do the quick division. But we're probably talking about hundreds of millions of dollars, right, that you're adding to the year-to-year bond debt. And bond debt is ultimately repaid by the taxpayers, right? When you pay off bonds, they come from the general fund. The general fund is money that's dispersed to this. It's like the state budget, right? So when you take a bigger chunk of that state budgetary pie, right, to pay off these bonds, you're interfering with other processes. For example, like road construction. For example, like education, right? So the more and more bonds you do, the more and more reasons why the state can say it needs to tax your gas, right? And it gets a little more complicated, to be intellectually honest here, right? The transportation funding, I think, is in a special fund. It's not in the general fund. I can explain the difference between that later, but basically special funds can't be touched by legislative allocation, whereas with the general fund, essentially there are certain rules, but the legislature can do as it wishes within those rules. Point being, though, you wouldn't need to create all these special funds if you had less bond indebtedness. So I understand that water is important, but essentially what this bill does, what this proposition does, is it gives a lot of people a lot of money to do unspecified things, right? I mean, they may not do anything with it. So is it needed? Yes, but I think the state perhaps could take a more pinpoint, budgetarily sound approach. And I would note that the proponents or the opponents of this affected on bond indebtedness, and I think that's wise. I forget which proposition it was last time in the spring election, but it was the same deal, right? It was another water bond, right? So the state essentially uses bonds to fund its water issues, which is essentially a 40-year-old check that we are going to be cashing for 40 years, right? The bill's going to come due for 40 years, to use the right metaphor. So, in generally, I would say no. Again, I'm a right-leaning Republican, so people who are okay with bond indebtedness are probably not persuaded by my argument. But and I thought I was fairly even-handed. I mean, I think Prop 3 does a lot of good things. I think it has the right governing model, which is not to have the state assert a lot of control, have innovation come from grant proposals and work there from the ground up, as long as the state provides the grist for it. I just think it has to do it in a better way, right? I think it has to do it in a way that doesn't force us to pay a tax in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, right? Because that's why we're paying these extra taxes. So, in short, Prop 3, while it's a very long and boring bill to read, it's a very simple concept. Fund various water needs, usually through grants, but sometimes, and this is the controversial part, through direct to farm allocations of money. But it does it for the smart purpose, right? I mean, I think if you're going to give big farms money, you're giving big farms and small farms money to make their land more arable, to better protect it from drought. So Prop 3 is pretty simple. In the future, by the way, so for these propositions I've been running behind, I'm going to try to catch up. My idea is to do Prop 4 tomorrow, and then Prop 5 the next day, and then 6 the day after that. I will be skipping some propositions, right? So Proposition 7 is stupid. I'm not going to discuss it. It's not worth my time. I will discuss 8. 9 isn't a proposition anymore, so really 7 and 9 I'm not discussing. I will discuss 10 and 11. I'm going in order. I know 6 and 10 are kind of the big ticket items, followed by 8. But I think people need to have some sort of awareness of all these propositions. So anyway, thank you very much for listening, and have a good evening.